Thank you for listening to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This episode is sponsored by Sideshift.ai, Citrea, LayerTwo Labs, Bitcoin.com News, NoOnes.com, and Edge Wallet. Hope you're gonna enjoy this one. Hello there and welcome to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This is season 16, episode 34. We are here at the Mallorca Blockchain Days, sitting next to Professor Richard Werner, well known for his best-selling book Princes of the Yen, and also the person who came up with quantitative easing. And you could also listen to him last year when we did an episode and we spoke a bit about what happened to the Silicon Valley Bank, to the situation with Swiss banks, where basically the biggest one acquired the second largest one. And it's not nice. You're an advocate for small local banks, and it seems like the trend has only gotten worse. This year we had the big, beautiful bill, and we also have a much more serious discussion about CBDCs, which last year was more hypothetical. If you said last year that what's happening this year was actually gonna happen, you would be labeled as a conspiracy theorist. And I also want to ask you about what you think about Bitcoin nowadays. So this is sort of a summary of the topics that we're gonna talk about. What do you want to start with?
Let's go through the list, in that order.
Let's start with what's happening in the US with the big, beautiful bill. Donald Trump ran on this platform that he's going to reduce government spending and external debt. But what he did was to go to the money printer and basically find ways to pay more money to some government agencies that he wants to be well funded. And this also led to a divorce between him and Elon Musk, and also him and a lot of his supporters. And it's interesting that this happened about 7 years into his presidency. It's really crazy. It feels like it's been years since the last administration. I'm curious what you think about this approach to basically enabling the government to have more funding at the expense of everyone else's savings.
Right. Well, first of all, one fundamental point. Fiscal policy, government spending is not directly money printing. That does depend on the central bank and the banking system and how they're supporting the fiscal policy. Because, for example, in Japan, we had the opposite extreme case where we had massive fiscal spending, government spending programs for many years, which at the time were the largest in peacetime history, so really very significant. But they had no impact on the economy. They did not accelerate growth. Everyone was surprised. Well, what, this huge spending bill? That should really boost economic growth. But it didn't. It also didn't cause inflation or some of the other effects that people thought. Maybe it will push up interest rates. It also didn't happen. Interest rates stayed rock bottom. So that's a good counterexample, to the narrative that's currently being put out, that this big, beautiful bill is immediately, sort of inflationary and is equal to money printing. That's not true. So that's on the positive side. However, of course, when you have massive government spending, it is actually, it's not good to have a fiscal deficit, a government budget deficit. It's not good. America has a huge one. And also America has world record and historical record debt, 37 trillion. And then we're going to now add more to the debt when a president came on the platform of cutting the debt, cutting the deficit. So that clearly is very concerning. But let's come back to the fundamental point. So is this inflationary or not? And the reason why in Japan, what was then record peacetime government spending programs did not cause inflation, they did not even accelerate economic growth. This is due to the fact that the banking system was essentially sterilizing this, or the central bank and banking system. They were not engaged with this, they were not backing it. And So what happened is the government funded the spending by borrowing money in the markets, issuing bonds. That's the same the US is doing. But then who was taking up those bonds? It was not the central bank at the time in the 1990s. And for the first decade of the 2000s, it was not the central bank, and it was largely not the banking system. So it was non-bank investors, government bonds held by pension funds and so on. And that means it's not linked to money creation. It was not linked to money creation. And when it's not linked to money creation, then the government spending actually has no impact. It has no impact on economic growth, and it also will not have any impact on inflation, prices. What does happen is it's a redistribution, because actually fundamentally at the core, government policy is always a transfer policy. We take from A and we give to B. The pie is the same, but we're now saying that part of the pie we give to you guys, and that part of the pie we give to you guys, and we take away from these others. This is what fiscal policy fundamentally does, especially pure fiscal policy that's not linked to monetary policy, that's not backed by the banking system through credit creation. So not monetized fiscal policy is just a transfer policy, and that's why, quite rightly, actually it raises everyone's blood pressure and people start to get into arguments, because it's like, hey, you're taking from these guys and you're giving to those guys. Well, those guys are happy, but the others are unhappy. That's what fiscal policy is about. And that is also happening clearly with this big bill. Okay, as Elon Musk was saying, yes, it's big. Whether it's beautiful is another question. And now, of course, the expectation has been that since the Fed in recent years has been monetizing fiscal policy, and also the banking system has been monetizing in America, that it will be different from what happened in Japan in the 90s and 2000s. And there will be an expansion, therefore, in money creation, in, nominal GDP growth. But to what extent will it be real growth? To what extent will it be inflation? Actually, there will be an inflationary aspect as well. So that's the difference. And we see the understanding of the Trump team of this point, because there has been a suggestion from the circle around the Treasury Secretary, that to the effect that there should be measures put in place to encourage banks, American banks, to buy more treasuries. And so actually that's exactly the point. So we know, okay, they do understand how to monetize the fiscal policy. Now, if you're critical of that, then yeah, you're worried, because if they understand it, they have articulated it, they're beginning to talk about concrete policies to essentially give banks an incentive, encourage them, make them buy more government bonds. It is likely it will be monetized. Although, having said that, there's still an uncertainty factor, because the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is also an important player. And we know that these ideas have not come from the Fed. They've come from the Trump team and his appointees in the cabinet positions. And there is a lot the central bank can do to more or less sterilize that if they want to. But that's something that remains to be seen. We have to see whether the Fed will counteract this. And the Fed has tools to also give incentives to banks to behave in a certain way. And it could, whatever incentives are given to banks now to buy government bonds and treasuries, the Fed could, if it wants to, basically neutralize those and give them other incentives so that they don't very much increase the treasury purchases. And also the Fed itself, of course, is more or less sovereign in its decision making, for good or bad, concerning its actual quantitative policy, because the real monetary policy is always the quantitative policy. They love to talk about interest rates, because then you don't get into debates. What are they actually really doing, and how are they allocating funds, and how much new money are they creating, and who's getting the new money? These are the interesting questions, but central banks never want you to think about that. That's why they love to talk, interest rates. They're now at this level, and we're raising them by 0.25%, or we're lowering them by 25 basis points, which is like very marginal stuff, okay? And the rate is the same for everyone. There's nothing to see here, nothing to debate, It's just, should it be higher, should it be lower? Which, frankly, most of the time is not so important, because you see, empirically we know, if you look at the facts, interest rates follow economic growth. And that proves that they're not really the key monetary policy tool that they're always made out to be. That's more or less a political maneuver by central banks to say, hey, look, focus on interest rates. That keeps our discussions pretty clean, and nobody is going to talk about what really matters. We can do what we want concerning the quantitative policies. Now, looking at the quantitative policies, the Fed can, if it wants to, tighten up quantitatively. Even if it says, on the surface, even to Trump, okay, we'll give in. We will lower rates. Trump and Trump team want lower rates, and partly they're falling for the central bank narrative that it's interest rates that are the key tools, and we must, to stimulate the economy, we must lower them. I mean, that's the official narrative, and they're falling for it. There's no empirical basis for this. Interest rates follow growth, and they're positively correlated to economic growth. If you want higher growth, you will get higher rates. There's no way around that. That's the empirical reality over the last 200 years in any economy, really. But the higher rates don't mean that you're suffocating growth. No, it's the other way around. Growth means that there are more returns, and that means all the yields are going up because there are more returns. And so, the treasury market is in line with that, and so yields go up. It's quite natural, and it's not slowing growth. That's the key thing for people to understand. So it's a sideshow. It's like a decoy, a detraction from this. The real question is the quantity of credit creation created by the banking system, including the central bank. And we have to see how they're going to react now to this bill. So essentially, that's my assessment, that yes, there is concern. It's unfortunately not, in this case, the situation that happened in Japan, where the fiscal policy was pure fiscal policy. It's likely to be monetized, but to what extent, we don't know, because the Fed, if it doesn't want to have this monetized, they can stop the monetization or minimize the monetization. Now, in the Japanese case, it was actually a problem that the central bank had this attitude. They totally ensured neutralization of the fiscal policy. And as a result, because it was a different situation, Japan had no growth, was in a recession, partly negative growth, nominal GDP for several years, shrinking by the biggest amounts in post-war history of any country, of any major economy in the world. And of course, everyone wanted to get a recovery, but the central bank did not want a recovery. So they ensured that credit creation remained stuck at zero or contraction, and fiscal policy was not backed with credit creation. So there was no recovery in Japan. So that was the problem there. Now in the US, the concern is more the other way around, that we already have decent economic growth. Credit growth is quite decent, just as it was in early 2020. And then in March 2020, the Fed really hammered in, accelerated, stepping on the pedal, accelerated credit creation by the biggest amounts and growth rates actually on record since the existence of the Fed, which of course created the inflation. That's what happened then. And we have to see what the attitude now is. There clearly is some antagonism between the Trump administration and the Fed leadership. But essentially the rhetoric is not what determines these economic matters. Don't listen too much to what they say, watch what they actually do. And we need to, it takes a few months to get the data to figure out, is the Fed tightening quantitatively? Is it staying neutral? Or is it actually giving in and is allowing the monetization of this? I mean, if the Treasury wants to take a very strong stance on this, particularly this proposal to get the banks to buy treasuries and other assets to expand credit creation. The Treasury is also powerful. It can do a lot. And this will be the interesting question. To what extent will there be a proper battle between the Treasury and the Fed? Because in the past, we haven't had this much. The Treasury and the Fed have more or less been influenced by the same sort of interests, Wall Street interests, both in the Treasury and the Fed. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is the real central bank. It's 100% privately owned by the Wall Street banks, So in the past, we didn't really have much antagonism. And that's also, of course, the fascinating aspect at the moment and something we have to watch and look out for. And I will be looking at also in my Substack, rwerner.substack.com, what's happening on that front.
Let me check the camera and then ask you the next question. That's good. I wouldn't want this to not be recorded. Anyway.
Okay.
Something that I really appreciate about you is that you approach economics from a data point of view. You're not much of an ideologue. You don't care much about the schools of thought. You don't think that ideas come before data. You think that data is what basically should shape our ideas. And something that's also interesting with the Trump administration is the fact that they returned to this 19th century practice of putting tariffs on everything. The United States historically hasn't done this over the last 100 years at least. Or maybe you know better, maybe that they never did that. But my question is, what do you think about tariffs? I think yesterday they announced like 30% tariffs on the European Union. And it seems like it's more of a way to renegotiate some ways of doing trade. But it also causes panic to the markets. And we saw what happened a couple of months ago when massive tariffs were announced and the markets crashed. And the reaction to that was very brutal. And I'm curious what you think about this situation. Does it generate a good outcome? You think it's healthy to try to renegotiate? Or was the system in place good enough?
Yeah. Now, traditional mainstream economic analysis is, economists, mainstream economists are really abhorred and shocked by all this because mainstream economics says you shouldn't have any tariffs. Tariffs is bad policy. It's a bad thing, even if you feel there's an uneven, unequal, biased trade relationship. Even then, one side putting on tariffs is not going to help anyone, is the argument. Now, that's actually not true. That's not factual. The fact is that tariffs in the past have been successful, and they have helped all the major economies become major economies. This has not happened without tariffs. So it is actually a key tool of economic development. There's no doubt about that. The reason is that, perhaps in a nutshell, very brief summary of these arguments in economics. It started with David Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage. He came out in the 19th century, and essentially the argument has been, updated, but it's still the same argument that's even used today in its core principles, namely, every country should focus on exporting what they're good at, their comparative, their relative advantage, in relative terms, not absolute terms, but relative to the others. Focus on your relative advantage, and that's the best outcome for everyone. Now, that is logically very compelling. And, with mainstream economics, there's never a problem with logic. In fact, that's the whole trick. That, we do find, particularly men, we find logic appealing, okay? and so logic is quite attractive. It's a tool of persuasion. But we mustn't forget one fundamental fact concerning logic. And this is the trick economists use, and David Ricardo also used. Logic works, in all forms. But it's in economics, since David Ricardo, in modern mainstream economics, logic has been set up as a theoretical tool within a theoretical assumed model, right? So you assume a fictional world, and then within that, you use logic. Now, the logic is compelling and is true and sometimes very elegant, and therefore is very persuasive. And as a result, everyone says, oh yeah, oh that's clever, that's true. And as a result, you forget the more basic fundamental fact that, oh, hang on, oh, this is just within a theoretical fictional world that doesn't exist, and that is very different from our real world. That is the trick. Or put it differently, just because something is logical and logically compelling and logically within the confines of logic, therefore true, doesn't actually mean it is generally true. Just because something is logical doesn't mean it's true. Why? Truth in the normal usage, when we live in this world, we use truth with reference to our world, our actual world. And that's the trick, you see. That truth has nothing to do with logic. That is just an empirical question. It's like 0-1. Is it like this or not? Now, the truth, the reality of our world is never contingent on, never based on, oh, is this a logical outcome? Should we have a world that is like that? Is that logical? It's irrelevant. What is our world? Sometimes the world we have is quite strange, and events happen that are random, and that are with some, approach from some theories will appear to be illogical, even irrational. Reality doesn't care, and that's just a question of using empirical data to find out, okay, what is the situation? Describe the facts of reality as it is now observed. And that can be very different from a fictional, elegant, logical model. Of course, the economists use a tool of logic called mathematics. Mathematics is pure logic, and it is very compelling, and it is powerful and can be used in many contexts, also with reference to reality, very successfully. But in economics, it's been used as a tool within this fictional world. And it's really become a rhetorical device to distract you with this beautiful logic from the fact that, oh, that's a fictional world. You see, David Ricardo, in his theory of comparative advantage, where he shows that it's sufficient for countries to focus on their own relative export area of advantage, and they will be fine. So people have concluded, therefore, that was enough for having successful economic development. And which, by the way, did not work. It hasn't happened. No country has developed based on free trade and free market economic policies. That's the theory, but in reality, this hasn't worked. So the alternative approach is the scientific approach in the natural sciences, where you establish the facts first, then you build theories that are consistent with those facts. And you will also use logic, of course, but you don't use it as a rhetorical device to distract people's attention from the facts of reality. So in other words, the approach to trade policy and also economic development that has been extremely successful is a very different one. What you do here is you take any country that has successfully developed, that has become a powerful economic nation, and you sort of reverse engineer. You go back and find out, okay, what did they do? What happened? What were the facts? What were the policies? What were the components that led to this result? And you don't want to start with ideological blinkers we believe in David Ricardo, and therefore we believe this fictional world, and we superimpose it on the past data. That would be complete, fraudulent an approach to this. There was a German economist, Friedrich List, who did this empirical approach, the scientific approach to economics. He was a great critic of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. He said, okay, let's analyze all the successful nations and how they became successful. And of course, he wrote this in 1841, so he didn't have the hindsight concerning what happened since. But just based on the previous analysis of the sort of a millennium of successful growth, the Italian city-states, the Hanseatic League, the rise of England, to become at the time, the number one economic and therefore military and political power in the world, Friedrich List analyzed and concluded that, well, all these instances show that there was trade policy, namely clever trade policy, in order to make sure that the country that uses the policy will also benefit from trade. Now, I'll tell you now another trick that David Ricardo did and that mainstream economics is still using in order to come to this conclusion that free trade is the best policy and we should never have tariffs. Namely, they don't talk about the terms of trade. So in David Ricardo's analysis, he makes a whole string of assumptions and then says that, okay, under these assumptions, if you just open up to free trade, every country focuses on what they're best at, then this will be the optimal outcome. But to get to this final result, he assumes that the benefits from trade are equally shared. Now, this is the weakness of this entire edifice of modern international economics. Essentially, David Ricardo correctly proved that trade can deliver prosperity. Okay, now that is the logical truth that nobody doubted. He was criticizing the mercantilists, the economists before him. Well, they knew that already. That's why they're called mercantilist, mercantile, merchant. It's all about trade. That's what they were about. So what was new in David Ricardo? Well, it was new that he distracted everyone's attention to not focus on how are these benefits from trade distributed. He just assumed, oh, they're fairly distributed. Where does that come from? It's not in his model. It's just assumed by assumption. And that's the other problem with mainstream economics. They just have these false assumptions. They're snuck in, sometimes as implicit, hidden assumptions, but they're crucial for their outcome to apply. And so it is with this free trade policy. It turns out that the empirical reality has always been that some countries manage to get a bigger advantage from the trade than others, and many countries actually, therefore, even though trade is beneficial in total, okay? So trade is good in total, but we don't know, and David Ricardo says nothing about how these benefits from trade are actually distributed. Which country is going to get them? The whole modern economics says nothing about that. This is determined by the terms of trade. Ricardo just assumes the best terms of trade that is equal. But in reality, how do we know this is happening? We don't. And if you measure the terms of trade empirically, so if you again adopt the scientific approach, which is empirical measurement of data, it turns out that we have a very good pattern over the last 100 years, just looking at different countries and the trade pattern, that the following principle applies. If you want to make sure you get the benefits from trade in your country, or sufficient benefits of trade in your country, you must move up the value-added ladder. You must make sure that you always export the most high value-added things you can, export. And you must actually, if you want to develop, have industrial policy and trade policy to upgrade your activities to a higher value-added level in order to have good terms of trade and therefore benefit from the terms of from trade and have good terms of trade. Now, in concrete examples, there's empirical evidence that countries that export commodities, which is the vast majority of developing countries, have deteriorating terms of trade. That means they constantly get less for what they are selling, their exports, and they constantly have to pay more for what they're importing, which is finished high value-added manufacturing goods. Because if you're a commodities exporter, you're exporting the stuff that's at the bottom of the hierarchy of value added, okay? And the reality is you will get paid in relative terms the least. If you're exporting something that's at the top of the hierarchy of value added, the most sophisticated, latest technology products, goods and services, software, anything, then you get the biggest margin. You get more in relative terms. That's an empirically established fact, and it's not surprising. So, it is also logical and consistent, and it's consistent most of all with empirical reality. Now, this means that developing countries, they've been encouraged by the IMF and the World Bank, more than encouraged, actually sometimes forced, to focus on comparative advantage, as David Ricardo and International Economics says, on what you're good at. Oh, you've got lots of land, you've got lots of agriculture, you've got lots of farmers. Well, you must export raw materials and commodities. Africa has been told this for 70 years by the IMF and the World Bank. And, the whole system of carrots and sticks and money is linked to this. If you don't do this, well, we cut you off from funding. Of course, in reality, they don't even need that funding, but that's part of the trick. I'll come to that in a moment. So, developing countries have, as a result, focused on being commodities exporter. And that means their terms of trade have been deteriorating because it's an empirical fact that over time, in general, sort of world income goes up. And that's partly due to to a large extent due to the monetary system. We always have some monetary expansion, so incomes go up over time, at least nominally, right? So, as world income goes up, the demand for high value-added goods goes up in line with this, or, more than that, but the demand for the raw materials doesn't go up as much. So the demand for high-valued goods benefits more from this trend that incomes go up, whereas commodities, ultimately, with good technology, you can economize on commodity imports in terms of quantities, also in terms of the range of inputs you need as technology gets more sophisticated. Of course, we're constantly economizing. That's more or less definition of progress, as economically. But that means that over time, the terms of trade of commodities exporters must go down, as they do historically. It's a fact. And that means if developing countries do what the IMF and World Bank tells them, and as they have been doing, they get less benefits from trade. And that means in reality, despite working hard and exporting all these commodities all the time, they will still have balance of payments deficits. Why? They have to pay more and more in relative terms for the finished manufactured goods. And that means they get poorer. A balance of trade deficit means actually they still have a funding problem. That's when the IMF and World Bank come in. Oh, you should let foreign investment come in. You need money for growth. We lend you the money, which is another trick. That's not true. You just indebt these countries. Where's the money coming from? Created by foreign banks. Well, these countries have their own banks. They could create their own money. And of course, all the successful countries that have delivered high economic growth and rapidly developed, like the high growth countries, Japan, Korea, Singapore, China, Taiwan. These countries and regions have focused on stepping up the value-added ladder, focusing on exporting high-valued goods, and moving away from raw materials and commodities exports. And then you will benefit from trade. Their terms of trade have improved, but while developing countries' terms of trade have deteriorated, and they get poorer and poorer over time. And the balance of trade deficit means they're borrowing more money from abroad, and they get into a debt trap because, of course, when you have a balance of payment deficit, your currency weakens. But you're borrowing from abroad in foreign currency, as the IMF and the World Bank make sure they arrange that you borrow in foreign currency. So then you're constantly increasing your debt in domestic currency terms as the domestic currency weakens against the foreign currency, and the foreign debt in domestic currency terms gets larger and larger. These countries, they're done for. I mean, that's what happened to them by the IMF and the World Bank. They're getting totally exploited. So it's very clear what you need to do is, and what happened empirically, and Friedrich List has shown this, how England became successful. And we know now with hindsight, since List went to press in 1841, his advice was spot on. Germany took it, America took his advice, and then later Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China took his advice. So they did exactly what was needed for economic growth, shift to high-valued industries, And in the process, you use trade policy. You do use tariffs. So tariffs, if you use them properly, can be very successful and a very clever tool. But what tariffs and on what? That's very important. What you want to do is you want to encourage high value added exports, and you want to encourage imports of raw materials. And you will have your tariff structure designed accordingly. And that means you can have import tariffs on high value added goods, because you want to encourage domestic production of high value added goods. And you can have tariffs on exporting raw materials, and you can have actually negative tariffs to encourage raw material imports. That's what you should be doing. Okay, so having said that, just to put this in perspective, so tariffs can be a very clever tool if you use them properly. Is America doing that? Now, Donald Trump, if you look at the videos when he was, decades ago, very young, he was already saying we should use tariff policies. And at the core of that is a correct idea. But it has to be the smart tariff policies where you encourage raw material imports, you want them cheaply, and you want to encourage the creation of value added domestically. He does say that he wants manufacturing in America, so he does get that point, absolutely. And then you encourage the exports of those things, and you can use your import-export tariffs in this way. But I've seen proposals from some people in the Trump administration imposing import tariffs on raw materials. Well, you'd never want to do that. I mean, that's, that doesn't make sense. But that's included, and that shows to me, okay, there's still a lack of a full insight into how you have to use the tariffs. Okay, and of course we have seen that, there's been the proposal of just blanket tariffs for a whole country, no matter what they are. Well, you would never want to, even if you want to impose tariffs on a particular country, well, if they're exporting certain commodities that you want and need and your industry needs, why put tariffs on that? Doesn't make sense, right? It's not needed. So we need a slightly more sophisticated pattern of the tariffs. But otherwise, I think, the fundamental idea is right that Donald Trump is using, namely, hey, we can use tariffs, which has, it's a shock to economists, as I started out saying, because all mainstream economics is like anathema. You can't have tariffs. Tariffs are always bad. But this was never true. It's just in their fictional, axiomatic, hypothetical models is it true, but not in reality. And of course, Donald Trump is, is a deal maker. And deals have to do with using your position, your advantage, and your power. And he correctly assesses that, well, America is the largest market for selling things to. Everyone wants to export to America. That is true. And that gives America certain power. And he's also correct in saying, okay, well, that's a sort of power we should use. And in fact, I'm very much against abusing power, and certainly projecting military power and abusing that is not a good idea. And I'm a strong critic of America on that front. But the idea that, we're the biggest market, everyone wants to export, and we're going to use that power, that I think is reasonable. That's a reasonable argument. And in proper, reasonable, and calm negotiations with other countries, actually, when you sit together and discuss these things, it is possible to come up with deals where everyone benefits. That's the beauty of it. We just need to ensure that that's what we're doing.
LayerTwo Labs is bringing the drive chains to Bitcoin. What does this mean? Basically that we're going to have side chains for every interesting use case that we see today in altcoins. For example, we can have an Ethereum sidechain to Bitcoin, which is one-to-one compatible with the smart contracts that we see on Ethereum today. We can have, for example, a Zcash sidechain, which is for fungibility. We can have a big block sidechain, which is prunable and actually helps with scalability and low fees. And we can also have assets like Namecoin or prediction markets, or pretty much everything that the crypto market can produce. Bitcoin will be able to just copy and pay the miners and basically have this flourishing Bitcoin economy. And you don't have to imagine what this is going to look like because the software is almost ready. You can download it for free at layer2labs.com/download. And that's where you can find pretty much the launcher, the side chains, and everything that's interesting and is currently running on the Bitcoin Signet version 4, if I'm not mistaken. So check that out. It's interesting. layer2labs.com. Thank you for sponsoring. Citrea is the first ZK rollup to enable Bitcoin to function as a fully programmable platform with a bridge optimistically verified by the Bitcoin network. What does this mean? Well, essentially, we're going to have smart contracts which are being built on top of this Bitcoin layer, which inherits the same security from the Bitcoin miners and is going to bring all the financial services that today we only have on Ethereum because it's more programmable, but using BTC and running on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. It's a very ambitious project which is trying to bring the first ZK rollup to Bitcoin. It's called Citrea. You can access it at citrea.xyz. That's CITREA.xyz. And the software which is available to download currently runs on the Bitcoin testnet. So check that out, and thank you Citrea for sponsoring. Edge Wallet is so much more than a simple wallet. First of all, of course you have support for a lot of assets, but what's most interesting about this is the way you can swap, you can exchange between various assets and also buy and sell directly from this interface. So let's imagine that you have a situation where someone sends you some Monero and you don't want to hold on to that, you want BTC. You can swap directly from within the Edge Wallet interface without even having to think about it. It's simple, it's fast, it's snappy. I have had a lot of fun with it. And here's a fun fact about it. It has a duress mode, which is very useful when you're traveling. And let's say that this is my wallet. You can see here that I have about $200 in it. And maybe that someone at customs stops me and says, "Hey, young man, show us your wallet and what's inside." And you can have a separate PIN, which in my case, let's say is 1, 2, 3, 4, wink, wink. And this is the PIN for duress mode, which means that right now the wallet is gonna be open and show that I have absolutely zero balance, no coins whatsoever. I'm only playing with this. I'm not serious about any of this financial revolution stuff. I'm just LARPing. So there you go. This is my PIN and this enables duress mode. And you can do this too if it's useful for yourself to protect your asset against situations where people ask you to unlock your wallet. So check out Edge at edge.app, and that's where you can download it for pretty much every operating system. It's cool, check it out. Many of the people in Bitcoin are quote-unquote Austrian economists, even though I'm not sure they agree with each other on some points of view. Some of them read Karl Menger, others just read Saifuddin, who is this guy who basically took some ideas from Taleb, took some ideas from Austrian economy and wrote this story which puts Bitcoin in the center of everything. And I guess a bunch of them would get triggered by what you just said about adjusting economic policy not according to ideology but according to data that you have, and would tell you to read praxeology or something like this. So how do you mitigate with the fact that a lot of the economic theory tries to say that it's axiomatic and empirically true and deals with the nature of reality as opposed to data, which is boring? I guess they're all trying to create nice stories and wrap everything around a story, and you're basically against that.
I'm against following gurus, and I'm always disappointed in any school of thought when it turns out that, all they care about is they have a guru. If you quote that guru, they're happy. If you say something that the guru, has expressed a different opinion on, then that's not, you can't say that, you can't, that's not scientific. We shouldn't have gurus, but economists are very much like that. The Keynesians have Keynes as guru, the monetarists have Friedman as guru, and the Austrians have gurus like Hayek, Mises, and several other economists, Austrian economist authors. But you know, the test should always be facts, reality, data. Now, they may claim they're looking at reality, but is this really true? Austrian economists, there's several leading such gurus have said, oh, we don't use statistics, we don't use econometrics. Why not? I mean, I can get the point that some people in the past have abused econometrics to misrepresent things, and I'm very much against that, and we need to expose that. But it doesn't mean you throw out the entire tool of statistics and econometrics. Why on earth would you want to do that? You know, just show us that you're using it properly and be subject to criticism so that, you know, we can make sure it is used properly, but otherwise it's just a tool. It's like saying we're not going to use a particular technology because we don't like modern technology. Well, you know, that doesn't make sense, you know. So I think we just have to always test whether what is being said makes sense, makes common sense, is reasonable, is fact-based, empirically evidence-based, and therefore is scientific. And that should be the standard. No matter who says it, did a guru say that or somebody totally unknown, that should be irrelevant. And so, yeah, that would be my response to that. But otherwise, I am quite happy to engage with Austrian economists. I mean, there's certain things I like about them very much. They do recognize very clearly bank credit creation, which, you know, some other schools of thought don't do because that's already too much reality for them. Because it's an institutional fact that this is how the banking system works. They've ignored it in neoclassical and mainstream economics for centuries, actually. Mainly because I think, you know, it was all started by David Ricardo. He was a banker. He had the agenda that he didn't want people to understand the banking system. And that's really been an issue. I mean, there's also Marxist economists. They've got the same problem. I mean, you've got Marx, who's supposedly a critic of all this system and capitalist system. But really, Marx was about creating friction, divide and rule. And actually, it's quite clever if you think about it. If you're a banker, what do you want to do? Well, you don't want anyone to point at you. And so mainstream economics has been very good at this, and Marxist economics is just a branch of mainstream economics, actually, because what it does is that, oh, everyone else is at fault, but bankers, oh, they're not part of our analysis, we don't need to look there. So there is a class struggle between essentially the middle class, the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call it, but essentially just ordinary people, the middle class in society, and the capitalist class. Now, who are these capitalists? Well, they're just large company owners, but banks are not part of them financially. It's just ridiculous. But you create this artificial contradiction, and then you're saying, well, the lower class, the proletariat, they're the ones that need to be given more power. And so you've got these three different classes struggling, but the key group that is actually most powerful, because it controls money creation, allocation of money, and therefore controls everything in the economy, is not part of the analysis. I mean, come on, that's pretty fraudulent, really. But of course, that upsets any Marxist economist because it upsets something critical of their guru, you know.
Yeah, you mentioned gurus, and you remind me of the situation in Argentina, right? You have this president who is very for free markets and is very open to trade, as opposed to his socialist predecessors. And you had a consensus of a lot of mainstream economists who were saying that he's going to lead the country into disaster. And I think some of the best known names who participated in this were Paul Krugman and also Stiglitz, if I'm not mistaken. And it's really interesting that you have these big names who are authoritative, and the mainstream media usually looks up to them and takes their opinions. And then whatever it is that they predicted turns out to be wrong.
Oh, yes, that seems to be the case, particularly with people like Paul Krugman. It seems to be a rule that you should do the opposite of what they're saying. I mean, that's the mainstream. The mainstream problem is, and I always tell my students, if you want a quick rule of thumb, then do the opposite of what mainstream economics says, and you're likely to be right, you know. That's how bad it's become in mainstream economics. But looking at specifically Argentina and its president, cutting government expenditure in principle is not a bad idea. Certainly countries should have, in my view, balanced budgets. This upsets the Keynesians. They always think, no, we have to have deficit spending. But, and we don't have time perhaps to go into details, but to me that doesn't make sense. And because essentially if you increase national debt, and then we've got a form of Keynesianism called modern monetary theory, MMT people. It's basically post-Keynesians, just relabeling what they're doing. But so these people are saying national debt is good and just have more debt. Well, that's not true. National debt has negative consequences, and particularly the consequence that you're increasingly extracting money from the economy, from the many people, from the taxpayers, and giving it to a small elite of those people who live on government bond coupons, the rentiers. They don't work. They just own enough government bonds to live off the coupon paid on those treasuries. And they want more government debt to be created. Then the rentier class will have lifetimes of, just relaxing at the beach and getting the coupons, while ordinary people have to work hard to pay those coupons. That's what national debt does. And we've seen it in America now with 37 trillion in debt. So if you look at the annual fiscal government budget, now the servicing of debt, interest on this national debt has become such a huge proportion of the annual budget that it's now bigger than what already was one of the most bloated items, namely military and secret service and all that military expenditure. The interest payment is already more. So it doesn't take long now for the interest payment to become the single biggest item. And then you see the complete craziness of this situation. Why on earth are we even paying this interest? What is this for? Because there's no justification for this. Because this started with the creation of the Federal Reserve. Before, national debt was almost non-existent. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with other countries. When you set up a system where you've got, in the old days, all central banks were privately owned. The Fed still is privately owned. Many central banks are still privately owned. Italy, South Africa, all sorts. But people forget this, that before governments issued money, banks also issued money, but governments also issued money. And then central banks came, and usually they came as the cartel of the biggest banking dynasties deciding, hey, we set up a central bank, then we can control all other banks, we control the whole banking system, and we can control the government. Namely, in the following deal, oh, you're a politician, you want money? Oh, no problem, spending is good. MMT, government spending is good. We'll help you. We'll raise the money for you. Just, it's technical, it's complicated. So for us to do this, you sign here. Just don't read the details, just sign here. Oh, you've signed the creation of the central bank, privately owned. And the job is, we will give you all the money as we promised. Look, we're making good on our promise. We'll give you all the money. You can overspend, keep overspending, keep racking up national debt, and we print the money. Of course, the government could have printed the money, and then you don't have to pay interest, right? So national debt starts to balloon the moment central banks come on stage and make this deal with the government that they have the monopoly on the issuance of money, and governments stop issuing state money. There used to be state money in many countries. But nowadays, any politician who says, oh, let's issue state money, their lives are cut very short, very quickly. And there's quite a few examples, including JFK, but also others. So that's the situation we're in, where the cartel of the big banks, not banks in general, just the big banking dynasties who control the central banks historically and many still today, they love the system, they love the government to get in debt because they can extract more money for their machine. So when the Federal Reserve was created, when the Bank of England was created, at the same time taxes were imposed. Why? Well, the bankers was saying, the central banks were saying to the government, we'll create money for you, we'll give it to you, we'll charge interest. Where's the money for the interest going to come from? Oh, taxes. We have to levy taxes. The federal income tax didn't exist until the creation of the Fed. There was no federal income tax in America. And that worked. In fact, interestingly, President Trump is talking about this era where we didn't have an income tax. And he's saying we can substitute tariffs for that, linking back to earlier discussion. This is partly true, but only partly because actually, when was the federal income tax introduced? When the Fed was created. So really, to be consistent, Donald Trump needs to abolish the Fed. A lot of people would like that. And if you ask me, that's an empirical question. Now, we know, based on empirical facts and data, economies can work really well without a central bank. We don't need the central planners, actually. And this is another area where actually I find the Austrians are very sensible. And their conclusions happen to coincide with what I've also concluded based on empirical evidence and empirical observations from reality, that we don't need central banks, we don't need central planners. A decentralized system is always more competitive. That's what the high growth systems of East Asia have proven. And originally it was Germany that first ran this system, Prussia before Greater Germany, and Prussia was all based on decentralization, where you delegate decision making to the lowest possible level, subsidiarity, and that is more sustainable, it's more flexible. It means you can upgrade always faster and react to situations fast. You have to have better training on all levels. Your general staff and bureaucrats, employees, people need to be better educated, but that's a good thing anyway, to educate everyone. So that's the system that is more successful, decentralized, and likewise for the monetary system, decentralized money creation by small local banks. We don't need central planners in this. Oh, but who's going to set interest rates is what some people will say. The market set rates already today because central bank rates follow the markets. So what are you talking about?
Before we move on to the topic of Bitcoin and CBDCs, I do want to ask a short question, because right now, I think for a long time, Romania has been like this experimental land where they have been trying austerity and other stuff in 2009 to see if the people accepted and if it would work, basically. And right now, after we elected a new president and we have a new government in place, basically we have to pay the bill for the pandemic spending, for the way that we supported and we still support the war in Ukraine, for a lot of the expenditure that the government has made, and we haven't really asked questions because most of the costs have been subsidized for 2 or 3 years, and now the subsidies are gone, and we have higher taxes on income, we have higher consumption taxes, which is VAT. It goes up 2% starting next month. Pensions are gonna start getting taxed, which before this was not the case. Scholarships for students are gonna get taxed. Salaries are gonna get sliced for everyone who works for the government. So everything is becoming more expensive. The income is becoming like 15% less for everyone. And this is only the beginning. It's not enough money. I think we have a debt of 40% of our GDP at this point. And I think the wise way to ask you about this is, if you are an advisor for the Romanian government right now and you could speak to the Minister of the Economy or something, what would you tell him about the situation? Is it a wise way to approach it, or should they seek expansion as opposed to reduction of the economy?
Exactly. I mean, it's quite obvious. It's all very simple. What you want is highest possible economic growth, which you can achieve always in the following way. And any country can have double-digit economic growth. Romania has so many, areas where it's just fantastic potential that Romania can easily have 12, maybe even 15% economic growth for decades, right? Because the only limit to growth is creativity, ideas, and we haven't seen any limit on that front. Therefore, there is no limit to growth, to economic growth. You just need to fund it. So how do you fund growth? In a decentralized fashion. That's the only solid, consistent, and reliable way of doing it, by having thousands of small local banks that lend only in the local area, get to know local small firms very well. They create money for productive business investment that gives you growth without inflation. Okay, so now you have high growth. You will soon find, oh, your fiscal situation is improving because just by having more growth, your debt to GDP ratio goes down because GDP is going up. And your fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is going down because GDP is going up. But at the same time, you have more economic growth. That means you get more tax revenue. So actually your fiscal deficit is going down. You're moving towards surplus, and your national debt is not going up anymore. That's also in absolute terms going down as you can repay national debt. So this is the best, and actually in the long run, the only way to move forward. And then you find that, oh, actually, we don't need all these taxes. We can reduce taxes. If you have a wise government, taxes will be low and people will prosper. Because how you organize society is not a natural law. It's actually all decided by humans. And this is therefore where you can immediately see whether you've got a wise government or you've got a government that doesn't really understand what's going on or doesn't really want to do the right thing. And then you get low growth, high taxes, huge debt, lots of payment on interest on the debt, increasing inequality, money taken from the many in taxes and given to the few, benefiting from, for example, the national debt. So it's, that's where we see whether we've got wise governments or not. I like some states, there are some states where we have almost no national debt. I mean, the absolute amount of national debt in Romania is still modest, which is good. So it's actually a good starting point to now adopt also growth-oriented policies that create prosperity. What people don't realize is, because all this talk about bad news, higher taxes, more expensive things, less, payments in net after-tax income or pension. It's just everything is getting worse for people. What people don't realize in this world dominated by narratives of austerity is that we can all have abundance. It's an abundant world. It is really a very abundant world. We just need to sort out our monetary policy and secondly, the fiscal policy. And if you have wise monetary and fiscal policy using decentralization, we could be so prosperous. And this can be done in any country, even now. We just need to spread the news and educate people and implement the right policies. We can do it. It's because there's no law of nature against it. We can actually decide this. It's all man-made and we can make it better.
To transition into the topic of CBDCs, I also want to shortly take a detour and talk about the war on cash that's happening right now. For the first time in my country, which by the way, I think the daily economy is like at least 50% of it is based on cash, just people paying in cash to each other. And for the first time ever, this government said that they want to restrict cash payments to collect more taxes, to get more VAT from every payment. I think this also reveals the fact that they might be owned by bankers to a degree, because on every card payment, I mean, maybe the average card holder is not aware of it, but there is a fee that goes to the payments processor and to the bank. And maybe after 100 payments or so, you're gonna pay a lot of money. Yeah. I think I read this, of all people, Andrew Tate came up with this, and maybe some people will frown upon me for using this as some sort of authoritative figure in economics, but he said if you have $50 and you pay it to someone in cash, he's gonna pay that $50 continuously, and it's always gonna be worth $50. But if you pay $50 by card, and there's a 1.5% fee for every transaction, then basically after 30, 40 transactions, that value is gonna go to the banks.
Exactly. No, that's absolutely true. And that again shows us the dangers of a system where a small number of people just want to get their hands into the till and take from the many people, from the masses, and transfer it to the few. And there's too many structures like that still. Whereas if you have a decentralized system with community banks, they can actually, and in fact in Germany they've done it, they have a payment system where they don't charge a fee. And in Germany it challenged MasterCard and Visa. Of course they also exist because people demand it, but you also have this cooperative banking, VPay they call it. And any cooperative bank, the technology is very simple. If you have a system of cooperative banks or local small banks, you could just use your phone, your QR codes or something on your phone, and you don't need to charge anything because the marginal cost is zero, of using this once you've established it. And if the bank is already earning enough money to stay, afloat from just offering its other banking services, there's no need to charge for this. But again, we have a power struggle here between the global, very big players and such decentralized local small players. And of course, the global players, they hate the traditional German banking system with what used to be thousands of local banks and then charging very little. But they've been forced to change already by the ECB. They've been crushed by the ECB. They've been forced to become property speculators, and now they're going bust left, right, and center. They're forced to merge. That's exactly as the ECB has planned it. And likewise, therefore, they will crush them and their alternative systems where they don't charge that transaction fee. So yes, cash is better because it makes it harder for all these intermediaries to just charge a little percentage. And it seems a small thing, 1%, 1.5%, but it adds up, and it actually does constitute a big drain on economic growth and prosperity of the majority of people. It's great for a small elite, but it's not good for the majority of people. So we need to preserve cash as well. And of course, cash is also freedom. As another well-informed person, the head of the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, has told us, if you use cash, we don't know when you're spending it, who you're giving it to, and also we can't influence that, and we can't stop you from doing it. Oh, that's great. But if you use central bank digital currency, we can impose the rules of how, when, where, how much, for what exactly, for what type of subcategory of product you can use it. And we have the technology to enforce all that. Wow. So again, cash, we need to preserve cash, and we need to be resistant to this totalitarian control tool that is central bank digital currencies.
Sideshift.ai is the ultimate place for your swaps. So let's say that you still have an XRP bag from like 6 or 7 years ago, and now it went to $4, and you're like, oh, I should really sell this, but you don't want to go to some KYC exchange. So how about you send that to Sideshift and you swap it to BTC, and you're gonna sleep much better at night, and you're not gonna be a shitcoin bag holder for much longer. Also, what if someone wants to pay you in stable coins and you don't want to hold on to that, because why would you? It's a bull market. So let's say that you go to Sideshift and you paste your BTC address, and then you're going to get a stablecoin address that you can send to the person wanting to pay you in stablecoins, and boom, whenever they make that stablecoin payment, what you're going to get is BTC to your wallet address. Check out Sideshift, it's really cool, good liquidity, low fees, Sideshift.ai. Nones.com isn't just an exchange, it's a revolution for the global south, through which War Chief Ray Youssef is trying to rally all the lines of the global south from Africa and the Middle East to build this army of people who are financially free. And what you find on Nones.com is a peer-to-peer exchange, is a debit card that you can use for spending your coins, is a gift card marketplace, is also a spot exchange, and a lot of cool stuff where everyone gets a seat at the table and everyone eats. This is the philosophy in noones.com, and it's definitely the place where you want to go if you want to participate in empowering Africa in ways which go beyond Live Aid concerts and virtue signaling and whatever. Just be a market participant, help them get the liquidity that they need, and help them improve their lives while you actually also improve yours. Because that's how it works. You build wealth, you engage in free trade, and it's all available on noones.com. Hey Anan, where do you get your Bitcoin news? Is it news.bitcoin.com? Because nowadays it's much more interesting than you ever recall, because they have news about silver, they have news about gold, they have news about what's happening with Bitcoin regulations around the world, not just the US. And they are also more objective and less politically biased, to say it lightly. And it's not what you remember. It's not the website that says BCH is faster and cheaper than BTC. Now it's orange. It knows very well the difference between BTC and BCH. And I think the journalism that you'll find is very solid. I do like their rebrand. I do like the fact that they're more neutral with their coverage. And I think it's a solid resource that you can use when you want to understand what's happening in this very confusing and diverse market. So check out news.bitcoin.com today. Right, so on the topic of CBDCs, which are central bank digital currencies, they borrow a lot of the technology from Bitcoin. They are highly programmable, which means that not only that they can be tracked, but the spending of this currency can be limited or restricted to only a few types of products, or maybe only a small subset of merchants and shops. And it sort of limits freedom by design. And this technology is being promoted as a way to go forward. It's wearing this futuristic mantra, and I guess it appeals to some young people who think that they're making payments from their phone and they don't have to carry cash anymore. And it sounds very modern and attractive, but it's also a big trap. And I was wondering if you think there is any upside to all of this.
All right, that's a difficult question. What could be the upside of central bank digital currencies? No, I don't see any upside. I just don't see any upside. It is too centralized, and that is actually what makes the difference. Because the fact is, we have been using the rest of the acronym BDC. We have been using bank digital currency is what we have. We have digital currency already. We've had it for many decades, and it works. There's no need to have the same, but with a C in front of it, centralized, central planning, digital currency. I don't see any upside on that at all. One could perhaps say that in China, where they already have CBDC introduced, is not yet nationwide, but it exists in the pilot areas. It has been introduced in a thoughtful way to minimize disruption of the banking system. And that's of course very understandable, because China, until not so long ago, until the early 80s, essentially had only one bank. It was a Soviet-style centralized system. And with one bank, the central planners reigned supreme. And then Deng Xiaoping took advice from Japan and created thousands and thousands of banks. Decentralized money creation is superior and it's very successful. So if you now introduce CBDC, this will kill banks and centralize the system. So they introduced the wholesale CBDC idea, which is now also being quoted in the West, which means it's not directly competing against banks. You have to have a bank account to use it. But the trouble is, while in China, I don't have the concerns, because they appreciate the role of banks, because they recently didn't have them. Now they have them, and they have prosperity thanks to the banks. In the West, I am concerned about this, because we know that the central bankers are very much operating against the interests of banks, and have been for the last 20 years dramatically, killing so many banks. The ECB has killed 6,000 banks in Europe. Many small banks have gone already and continue to disappear thanks to ECB policies. So in that world, even if they say, we first introduce wholesale CBDC, like in China, so it's not bad for the banks, well, because you can't trust them, and you can easily switch to retail and the banks are gone. Particularly as I believe they've been working to create a banking crisis in Germany, which I expect within the next 2 years. You could argue it's already started on a small scale with some banks, and the property market in Germany, it will blow up to a maximum sort of crisis potential probably within 2 years. And then if you say, now let's roll out CBDCs, everyone will be more or less forced to shift their deposits from banks to the central bank. Likewise, they're saying, initially you can have a maximum balance only of 2,000 euros or any number you want, but you can just press the button and increase that to infinity, and the banking system, if it's done during a crisis, will be gone. But that's what they want, you see, and that's what we have to stop. So we mustn't allow it at all in the West, where we definitely can't trust the central planners.
So what do you think is a good way to stop this? Is it by using cash and constantly maintaining or even increasing the demand for it? Or do you think that switching to Bitcoin or some other type of digital currency, which is decentralized, is going to create the kind of competition that will make these people think, well, maybe deploying a CBDC is not the right move?
These are strategies, yes. Also, and if we had increased use of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it would be good if we then had more small banks that engage with that actively. And then you can have, I think it's an ideal combination actually, where you have cryptocurrencies and banks that are happy to work with that and create a whole cryptocurrency-based economy where you have bank credit creation on top of the cryptocurrencies. Because with the cryptocurrencies, certainly with the Bitcoin design, which is clever, but is limiting ultimately the production, the mining of currency. And at some stage there will be no more expansion, which is clearly one of the attractions. But at the same time, it means no more economic growth if everyone used Bitcoin. But the solution is, well, as we mine more and more, and we're beginning to run out of mining, further mining potential, we increase small local banks using Bitcoin and adding credit creation of the banks onto the money supply from Bitcoin. That would be, a logical way of handling. But in concrete terms, what can people do? I think we need to organize demonstrations outside central banks. Because they're not politicians, they don't have a thick skin, they don't want publicity. They will find this embarrassing, and it is embarrassing. It will be highly embarrassing. Because you see, their narrative is not a very strong one. I mean, their justification for CBDC is so weak, it's laughable. There is no justification. It's a joke. So if you have the public, just a decent group of people, say 1,000, 2,000 people outside every central bank in Europe every day, and you can take turns, people take turns, just always for some people to be there, some bus loads coming in. Peaceful demonstrations, but demonstrations against the introduction of central bank digital currency. What are they going to do? They will have to scrap it. They will have to scrap it. The only hope then will be that there will be global war, and then under wartime emergency measures where, media and public feedback is irrelevant, they can introduce it. But they will have no other option, I think. Otherwise, they will have to phase it out or just put it on a delay very much into the future, the introduction. Because how are they going to argue against the public opinion being against Bitcoin? You need some reasons why it's actually necessary, and there aren't any reasons. It's arguments like we had Lagarde say, well, there seems to be demand for it because there's demand for Bitcoin. Well, actually, Bitcoiners would say, well, hang on, you at the ECB have created demand for Bitcoin with your policies so far, thanks, and we don't need CBDC on top of that. That's more of the central banking, central planners solutions, which nobody wants and needs. So that's absolutely no argument. That's not an argument at all for CBDCs.
At the same time, we do have something which resembles a CBDC, except that it's not created by the central banks. We have something that's called Tether, for example, which is the biggest competitor to Bitcoin right now. It's basically a US dollar on top of a blockchain. Ironically, it was created on Bitcoin initially, and then it went to Ethereum and Tron and Solana and a bunch of other networks. And what it does currently is to allow citizens of the world who don't have access to US banks or US dollar to trade US dollar digitally. My girlfriend is from Iran. Her country is under a lot of sanctions, but if her parents want to send her money, they go to a local exchange desk, they pay in cash, and what they do is send this USDT, that's what it's called, to my girlfriend's wallet, and then she goes and she picks it up from a local ATM. And it's a hack around the banking system. Some people say it's liberating, but at the same time, it's also highly regulated and prone to censorship and can have the same features of a CBDC, except that people think, or at least so far, they think that it's something that liberates them and gives them more financial freedom. And I was wondering what you think about these quote-unquote stable coins.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, and you've described this really well. I think also that's exactly how the central planners see it. And I've heard the central planners say things like, well, stable coins are the future. It seems to be their plan B, as they realize, particularly since COVID, since 2020, where they were so blatant, just joining the central bank digital currency narrative for no good reason with this worst pandemic in global history type of narrative, which has really reduced its credibility further. So they've realized, okay, maybe we need a plan B, and it seems to be stablecoin is the plan B. So I think that is exactly as you say, and so that is a backdoor way for the central banks to still get a lot of what they want, and perhaps they will then hope to have this as the entry door to then ultimately launch their CBDCs and then roll out Plan A again, having first, pushed ahead with Plan B. So I do see that. Now there is actually a Plan C, and that is also being rolled out completely by stealth. And that is really scary. This Plan C is because actually you see how these powerful interests in the background, they seem to be more powerful even than the central banks. They seem to be sort of behind the central banks, because this Plan C doesn't even use central banks, but can achieve the same thing. And what is this? Well, we have currency, we have money, but then we also have the entire corporate sector, which is using money for everything, right? So let's say that from a central bank viewpoint, okay, if there's resistance against CBDCs, we can't do it. How can we still get the same result, at least in the corporate sector? Well, if we impose certain rules on all companies, on all corporations, on small firms, every incorporated company must have digital reporting of its activities, of its transactions on a real-time, daily basis, by being forced to use software that is plugged in to a national grid where the government can get the information immediately. And you see, when you use currency from a corporate viewpoint, you send an invoice and somebody pays, you receive an invoice and you're paying. So these are all, money has its mirror in the accounts of the corporate sector. At least, it's easier to start this on the corporate side, so we'll leave out individuals for a moment, but, you can roll that out on the, some pretense later. So for the corporate sector for now, it's Plan C. Now, I tell you, this is already happening. There's some countries in Europe that have already implemented the first stage of this. And it's based on an EU directive. So it's back to the unelected, undemocratic, dictatorial European Commission, which is the European dictatorial government we have in Europe. most people think, oh, it's Brussels. Yeah, they're a bit bureaucratic, but it's a good system. It's democratic. We have a parliament. They will check. The parliamentarians, they're good people. There's some wild debates in the European Parliament, which is true. Some interesting debates. They'll check and make sure it's not going to get out of hand. Well, I'm sorry, this is not true. While we have great debates in the European Parliament, that's all it is. It's a debating shop. They have no power to formulate, draft, and propose and pass any law whatsoever, and they've never done so. They're not the lawmakers. A parliament matters as a proper parliament in a democracy if these are the lawmakers, but that's not the case in Europe. The European Union was modeled on the Soviet Union. Now, a few people realize the Soviet Union was a democracy, allegedly. And of course, we know this is fraud. It wasn't a democracy. But how do they substantiate that claim? Oh, it was a democracy because we have a parliament in the Soviet Union. They had a parliament, it's true. But we know it was a rubber stamp parliament that had no power. They were not the lawmakers. And the Soviet parliament just had the appearance of a parliament. That was the appearance of democracy. But they could not draft, propose, and pass any single law that they had come up with. 100% of all the laws came from the unelected, all-powerful, dictatorial Politburo, which was the Communist Party cadre. That's the system that was introduced in Europe as the core and center and model of the EU. The parliament in Europe is just the rubber stamp parliament, like the Soviet parliament. How many laws have they drafted and then got through as laws? Zero. They have no power to do that. 100% of all the laws come from the unelected dictatorial Politburo, which they call the European Commission, where they even have commissars, like in the communist era. That's the real government, and it's a dictatorial government. It's not a democracy. They will quietly admit all this. Yes, there's a democratic deficit, is how they put it. And the MEPs, the members of European Parliament, they will confirm this, but they don't want to talk about it because they get huge, massive salaries, 20,000 euros per month, basic, plus. I mean, of course, they enjoy this life. They don't want people to realize it's a debating shop. They can maybe sometimes delay passing a law which all come from the European Commission, the dictators. But that's all they can do. They have no power. So that's the situation we're facing. Now, this dictatorial EU has already passed laws, and in this case, actually directives, already 2014, I believe, or maybe 13, more than 10 years ago, which introduced the legal framework for this, to force in a country all companies to only use particular online software that's directly connected to the government, and then make it illegal to send an invoice to anyone if it's not through that system. Mm-hmm. And then there's immediate reporting, feedback, all the data is there for all your spending. Well, it's almost like a digital currency, only it's the other side of the transaction. But it has the same effect of total control. And of course, you can just add a few modules, and then it's like a CBDC. Now, I'm sad to say, one of my favorite European countries that is very much critical of the dictatorial EU is actually one of the first countries that has introduced this, and that is Hungary. They have the system, and it's really scary. So if you set up a company in Hungary, there's no commercial freedom. Sometimes you have to send an invoice and then you negotiate, okay, we'll cancel that invoice, we'll do something else. We can't do that anymore. It's all through this approved software online immediately. Within 24 hours, it has to be in that system. Otherwise, it's an offense or something. I mean, it's scary. So there is also this plan C that we have increased enforcement. And they're actually now in Germany and other countries, they're beginning to take the same steps, not surprisingly, because it was all planned by the EU to do this. So there's other routes, and we have to be constantly vigilant to stop all of that. We want freedom. Commercial freedom is the basis of prosperity. I mean, that's such a restrictive system. I think we should give small companies more commercial freedom, not less.
On the topic of how the European Union institutions work, the parliament can vote to impeach the commission. And I think there was a vote this week or last week that was actually started by a Romanian member of the European Parliament who was not happy about the spending during the pandemic on vaccines and pointed out to a conflict of interest between the president of the European Commission, Ursula
von der Leyen. Yes, von der Leyen. Yes, exactly. So she was on track to be impeached, but then that's when the horse trade starts. And then she, because she's so powerful, she and her appointed, hand-picked commissars, they have so much power over everything, including budgets, including payments to members of parliament and their expenditure approvals and all sorts, So that's when the horse trade starts. And surprise, surprise, there was no majority against her, sadly. So this is very sad. And of course, the move was correct because outrageous things have happened. Breaches of law have happened. In fact, the European Commission has been demonstrably corrupt. There was, it's not so long ago, I think around, more than 10 years ago, the entire European Commission, including its president, resigned together. And it's astonishing how little coverage this got with the media. They immediately, let's move to the next topic. Let's not dwell on this. They all resigned because of proven corruption. And of course, we know in this Pfizer case, Ursula von der Leyen very informally signed off billions and billions of orders from this pharmaceutical company for toxic products that nobody wants or needs and have no medical benefit whatsoever. And her husband happens to be an executive of that company, and there was no accountability of that deal. It was not done through a proper, arm's length tender. So, that is at best highly suspect, if not outright corruption. And so it was right for people, MEPs, to focus on that. And I think they shouldn't give up because, of course, no consequences were faced by anyone concerning all the corrupt practices of so many politicians in so many countries, mask deals, politicians getting millions from mask manufacturers, sometimes owning mask manufacturers themselves or their husbands or wives, and they impose these mask mandates while they actually literally then get millions for that. I mean, so many outrageous things happened. We haven't seen anyone put in prison for any of that, and that's not to mention the many millions killed by the lethal injections after this, when they pushed these injections and even wanted to make them mandatory.
Yeah, and there are countries where basically they want to add that as mandatory vaccination for children, because in the first years of life, children do some vaccinations, some of which are reasonable, like polio or whatever, which have been tested for many years. And then
actually, that's an interesting point. We tend to think, well, this has been tested for years, but it was Robert Kennedy Jr. that pointed out that no vaccine whatsoever has ever been tested for its benefits, in the sense of demonstrating that it has objective absolute benefits. They always have these relative comparison control groups where you're given another vaccine or another shot of something else, and as long as that's also bad, you get relatively good results. It's like Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, where relatively, this is not so bad. I'm from a medical family, and I used to also think that, certain vaccines like perhaps tetanus may be necessary, but I've come to the conclusion that none of them are necessary. And if you look at the data, the evidence is really shocking. There's really no convincing evidence on any vaccine. And all the claims made, but polio has saved so many lives. Well, actually look at the facts and do some objective analysis without, heated debates or bias. Just objectively, you will find an astonishing result. So, actually, one problem is, the fundamental idea we all understand, and it's good to have a strong immune system and boost the immune system, but sadly, these injections have been used for different agendas, and there's been so many toxins in there, causing so many side effects that have been denied and fiercely denied, and people have been silenced over this, including autism related to this and so many problems, The good news is that once you realize how this works, there's actually ways in which one can uncontaminate the body and get rid of the contaminants that sadly have a very negative effect on us. I mean, it's astonishing that, you know, it's recognized that if you have too much formaldehyde in your floor, in your house, and you're walking on it, then that could have negative health consequences. But formaldehyde in vaccines injected into your body, oh, that's okay. Ditto for mercury and a whole list of other poisons, you know. We recognize, oh yeah, this is dangerous. You shouldn't have it in your wall, in your floor, in your house, or in your clothes. Oh, but injecting your body, oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's fine. No, it's not. And certainly babies don't need any injections whatsoever.
My 2 doses of the COVID vaccine were the Delta and the Omicron. And the reason behind this, and the reason it was not Pfizer or something else, and I got infected with the virus instead, was that I was looking at the data around the time when the vaccine came out. So it wasn't some conspiracy theory or whatever. It's just that I was looking at global data. And I was looking at countries where the vaccine was not available compared to countries where the vaccine became available. And in a matter of weeks, I realized that there's no real difference. And they were trying to explain, well, there are different environmental conditions. And in Africa, for example, where they had almost no vaccines, the weather is hotter and the virus doesn't spread the same way. And I was thinking, well, it's not so compelling for something which is so deadly and it's being advertised as such. And also the vaccine was also advertised for stopping the spread. They were saying, okay, you take this shot and then we can all go out and mind our own business, go to restaurants and enjoy life. It just didn't happen. And it was so disappointing. And in the EU, it was so authoritarian with the so-called green card, where you needed some sort of digital certificate to travel or to go to certain places, go to restaurants or whatever. I was getting tests all the time, but after I got infected, I got some mercy from the overlords who gave me a few months because I have acquired natural immunity. I was able to travel for a few months. I remember 4 years ago when I came to Mallorca the first time that I had to take a test to be able to leave the island. And for some reason, my test result did not come within 24 hours, and I was starting to panic. I was thinking, my God, it might be positive or something, and they're reporting to the authorities, and I'm going to be stuck here. It was horrible.
Yeah, no, it was quite a nightmare. But it was a good exercise for us to see what happens when we give essentially dictatorial powers to people that are able to then determine our lives. The reality is that most people can't handle power because power brings with it a whole lot of temptations, how it can be abused. And sadly, most people start to abuse that power. That's why we need always decentralized power structures. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. That was a great exercise in centralized power. And we found that they kick human rights with their feet. Suddenly, individual freedoms were worth nothing. The constitution in Germany clearly says you have all these basic rights and they're inalienable, but they did take them away and it was okay and nobody faced any consequences. So it was quite a shocking era, but it taught us about the dangers of giving so much power to people. We just need to decentralize. And of course, the big lesson is, therefore, we don't need central bank digital currencies. And they made the big mistake of linking this to the COVID, because during COVID, the central banks all came out. Oh, this is a good reason now to introduce CBDCs. The Bank of England came out already in March 2020. As soon as the lockdown was announced, okay, we have a public session about the need for the introduction of central bank digital currencies. So it was directly linked to COVID, which was crazy. I mean, there was no logical reason, actually, in my view. But they revealed, as they sensed, oh, this is a great moment to tighten the controls. Let's introduce our control tool now. And that was a failure. It just made people aware what's going on.
Yeah, also, this is a Bitcoin podcast, so I have to ask you about Bitcoin too. I think last year you were trying to explain that you don't believe that an economy with a deflationary currency can exist, and you need credit creation and the ability to give loans. And if you're going to have this situation where a bunch of people hold a lot of Bitcoin and they don't want to do anything with it because it goes up in price in US dollars, you can't really build an economy on top of it. But do you think there could be a way that the world could function on a deflationary currency, or will we always need something else?
Yeah, I think it doesn't work with a deflationary currency. Now, Bitcoin is compared to gold and it's said to be digital gold. And if we do look at the record for a record of gold, some people do argue, well, when we had a gold standard, that was deflationary. It was okay. It was good because this, the bankers couldn't create money. That's actually not true. Banks always created money throughout history, and any gold standard, you name the period and the country, and I will show you that banks still created money separately from the gold. So it was always, yes, the gold, okay, that's your currency, fine, but also you had bank credit creation, and that actually worked, and that's why it worked, because you were not limited to just the gold supply and the gold that's put into circulation and not hoarded and so on, because there was flexibility, because banks created credit and expanded, therefore, the effective money supply. But we can do the same with Bitcoin, and we can have small banks. We can have Bitcoin, and then we can have banks in a decentralized fashion on the back of it, creating credit. Mm-hmm. And we can link them. Banks are great nodes for a community to cooperate, collaborate, even issue also, if you want, local currencies, alternative currencies, different systems. You can have experimentation. That's the good thing about it. A decentralized banking system is a very flexible structure, as long as the central planners don't, overimpose their controls on it. That's what we need to strive against. At the moment, bank regulation is far too heavy-handed. It's clearly failed. If the goal was to avoid banking crises, then it's failed, because we still keep getting the recurring banking crisis. So might as well scrap all this very inefficient, centralized bureaucracy, imposing complex rules on banks that don't fulfill their purpose of preventing banking crises. The main rule you need, just one rule to prevent banking crises, and that is that banks should be restricted to creating credit only for transactions that contribute to national income. If you did that, you would have no asset bubbles, and that's the biggest source of banking crises. Now, a counter argument is, well, how do young people then, how they're realistically able to buy a home, a house, a flat, an apartment? Well, you need a loan for that. Okay, well, I'm not saying let's abolish loans. You can still give loans, it's just not from banks. We can have non-bank specialized mortgage companies that fund themselves through issuing bonds and therefore raising money in the capital markets from existing money. And then you have existing money funding asset transactions. That makes sense. And the banks focus on productive credit creation. Now, in many countries, that used to be the system. But then that was, in the 80s, in many countries, was deregulated and liberalized because allegedly it's better to mix that up, and it was not better. It just created asset bubbles and banking crises.
Nowadays, we have a lot of Bitcoin companies that they issue stocks, they borrow money, they buy Bitcoin, and then they borrow money against their Bitcoin, and they keep this scheme up just to accumulate more Bitcoin and be worth a lot. And then people will see that they hold a lot of Bitcoin and buy the stock. And that's the psychology behind it. We have MicroStrategy in the US and MetaPlanet in Japan, and quite a few examples that are starting to use this playbook. Do you think it's sustainable, or is it just a bubble that will burst as soon as there's nobody else to lend them money and they have to pay back their debt?
I think it's a more or less inevitable outcome of current events. So, and I'm not too concerned by it. Because in the end, you don't want to intervene with laws and restrict that, and it will always happen in this way, and has always happened in the past. So I'm not too concerned. Overall, concerning Bitcoin, I think we are in a very bullish phase where the price is likely. Obviously there's ups and downs and sideways moves, but overall, I think we are in the phase now where we're running up to, in the coming years to $1 million per Bitcoin. As more
$1 million per Bitcoin, is that your prediction?
Yes, I mean, okay, don't take me too specific, because I think actually it will stop just short of that. So maybe 995,000 or something like that, you know, but just short of $1 million, I think, is where we're going to get. Yes, there's some reasons for that, and mainly it's the common phenomenon that as the whole thing picks up momentum, more and more players, bigger and bigger players, partly are forced to get on board, and partly they don't want to lose out, you know, the usual, but partly it becomes necessary for asset managers that have a mandate to be, you know, delivering certain returns, being present in certain markets and so on. As more and more, as governments get in on it, you know, it's just the momentum picks up, more and more players come on board. It's more or less inevitable, particularly in a system where the supply of Bitcoin is severely restricted, right? Unlike in some other asset markets. So, having said that, so I think there's a great run ahead, but one has to also be careful, because I think that there is a risk, a high risk, that something was built into Bitcoin early on, some kind of death switch, or a switch to, you know, there's in principle, I think there's many ways to achieve a certain goal, which is to switch it off, and therefore essentially expropriate everyone who is in Bitcoin at one stage, because we have this history that likely there were secret services involved in the creation. Now, it may be possible to somehow avoid that, and that, you know, that would be good, but the risk is there, I think. I mean, it could even be nothing internal. Maybe there's no secret formula or some kind of backdoor in some code somewhere. No, maybe not. But it could be even something external, as an EMP that kills, you know, essentially computer systems and networks across the globe, as part of whether it's a world war or whether it's some other event. Or whether it's actually sun activity becoming highly unusual for us in our very short experience where we have good records, and causing an EMP or something. You know, just the possibility, because you see, while Bitcoin has good elements of decentralization, and most people in cryptocurrencies love the idea of decentralization, which is great, and that's where we fully agree. The fact is, there is also a common electronic link that may be susceptible to a common way of attack or failure if something goes wrong. So we have to see. But, you know, I'm bullish, but I'm also cautious. I think at some stage it will be probably wise to take profits as we approach $1 million.
We in Bitcoin like to dismiss this sort of criticism about taking down the power grid or shutting down the internet as saying, well, if that happens, we have much greater concerns, because the governments also use the internet for storing their databases.
True.
The banks also hold all of their assets on some sort of electronic ledgers, and if those are not connected anymore, then it can lead to chaos and people not being able to spend their money, not being able to access their savings. And it's much bigger than just Bitcoin.
No, I agree. I mean, this is true. These are good points, absolutely. So one has to put that in relation to that. So it's a sort of a relative criticism, not an absolute criticism, because it applies to other systems as well. Again, I would say, of course, that if we have a decentralized, small, local bank-based system, that creates always the possibility, even if there's no electricity, switch back to analog. Even paper records, a tally stick, Hazelwood, contracts, all sorts of systems are possible. And the beauty is with the local banking system, the local bank can support them, and they can work, and they have worked in the past. We have seen 100 years ago, after the First World War, where in some continental European countries, in quite a few areas, there was real destitution, there was even starvation, as Britain despite the armistice and the obligation to stop military action, used its navy to blockade continental Europe from receiving food. So over 1 million people starved in Germany in 1919. So during that time of great destitution and hardship, a lot of local areas issued their local currency on all sorts of, scraps of paper, local government backed, just the mayor saying this is now our currency in a lot of areas. So I think that sort of thing is always something that can be done. We mustn't underestimate our resourcefulness of doing that. And just, being open and perhaps having some plan Bs and plan Cs for ourselves also available, not put everything in one basket, is probably a wise strategy as well.
Bitcoin started out from this idea of everyone being their own bank and becoming a global currency that anyone can use without permission, without having to trust any central authority, because you can verify the supply, you can verify the transactions, you can see that the rules are taken place and there's nothing hidden in there. But I think gradually over the last few years, we have seen a transition to the store of value function. And this is due mainly to the fact that Bitcoin did not scale for payments. At one point, the fees were very high for transactions, but also due to heavy regulations and the fact that governments feared the competition of Bitcoin. And some people realized that turning this into an asset in which people can invest to preserve their savings is not dangerous to the system. But in spite of all of this, do you think that Bitcoin can still become a currency that people use for payments? Or do you think this use case of saving money with it will be prevalent?
I think it is important to work towards using Bitcoin more. I think this would be very helpful for everyone. And is actually a way of mitigating some of the risk. Because if it is just a store of value, that makes me get more concerned about this potential, insider, Secret Service, deep state hack where they will just switch it off. Because if it's just a store of value, isn't that brilliant to switch off the claims on resources by a whole group of people suddenly to zero? This temptation will be enormous. Whereas if it's more of a flow thing with much higher reliance of transactions using it, then that temptation will be smaller, and actually then there will be more of an interest in maintaining it. So in a way it's risky to allow Bitcoin to be only a store of value, because the deep state players are given the biggest incentive to then try to find a way to switch it off at some stage. And so, but also I think it will help to spread Bitcoin if we actually use it more for transactions. And maybe we need to think about this actually and get maybe into some collaboration with some tech guys. I'm working on establishing a bank, and I'm very keen for the bank to be active in the token area as well, which in Switzerland, is perfectly legal. There's legal certainty, and it's actually encouraged as part of government policy. And then work out a way in which we can use this collaboration, where the bank is quite keen to expand also transactions based on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to implement that. Because I think we need more solutions there while we make sure that the transaction cost is low. I think that would be good for everyone. It'd be good for Bitcoin itself and for where we are in terms of valuations, but also for the longevity of the system, and also to basically then to have more vested interests in maintaining the system in the very long run is always good. So I think that's a worthwhile type of cooperation I'm looking forward to.
I've used most of this interview to fulfill my curiosities, but I'm also going to give you the opportunity to promote what you're doing. Before we started this interview, you said you had to work on the Chinese translation for Princes of the Yen, which is coming up next. Is there anything else that you're doing which is interesting and you want to advertise?
Okay, well, I've mentioned already the Swiss bank project, which is ongoing.
Does it have a name?
Well, it's in the Rhine Valley, the upper Rhine Valley, before the Rhine goes into what in English is called Lake Constance, in German is called Bodensee, which is the largest sort of lake connected to Germany, in the south of Germany. And so this valley, Rhine Valley, is bordering Switzerland and Austria and Liechtenstein, and also on the other side of the lake, Germany. So we've got 4 countries there. And the idea is to establish the bank in that valley, Rhine Valley, Rheintal, Tal means valley. Rheintaler Bank is the name of the bank. Of course, that's where the name of the dollar comes from a tal, namely in a tal in Bohemia, a valley in Bohemia where the biggest silver mine has been, Joachimsthal, and then the silver coin struck by the Habsburg Empire used to be called, after this valley, Joachimsthaler, Thaler, then short just from the valley, Thaler, and Thaler became dollar. They were used in Mexico, which was Habsburg, and then because the early US didn't coin any of its own coins, it used the Mexican, the Habsburg, the Austrian silver coins, and the dollar became then the global currency. So we're sort of coming full circle with the Rheintaler, the Thaler Bank, and it's going to be a cross-border is the idea. Of course, you've got to do this step by step and very carefully within all the regulations. Banking is heavily regulated, but banking is also very profitable. Just because they're closing down small banks by merging them doesn't mean the small banks are not profitable. They're very profitable. They're very attractive targets for mergers. So it's a very profitable proposition to create a bank. I think we need to create more banks. I'm working on that. I'm writing a Substack. People can follow me on Substack. It's rwerner.substack.com. That there is a small subscription fee for that. And otherwise, I'm, when I have time, put out videos also on YouTube under Werner Economics. And there's a few websites, richardwerner.org and professorwerner.org has a lot of my academic work as well. And yeah, I'd be keen to hear from people. And there's a lot to do. We need to move forward, educating people, spreading the news, and being active, actually doing something on this front. So thanks for your support.
Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for this interview. And I look forward to seeing how your predictions are gonna take shape, I really want to see 995,000 Bitcoin. That's where I'm selling.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.